Welcome to Deep Focus, a radio show about movies and New Haven. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and I'm joined in the studio today by my movie reviewing buddy, Alan Appel. Alan, it's good to have you back. It's
Hi,
good to
Tom.
be here.
Pleasure.
I gave Alan some last-minute viewing assignments for today's show, but I think that he is much more prepared than perhaps any other guest could be because he has a pretty long and intimate relationship with the subject matter of one of the movies we'll be talking about today. That is The Catcher Was a Spy, a new movie from director Ben Lewin about a documentary of the show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, than the man himself, but I think there's plenty of interesting stuff to mine there too. Alan, how about we, to do a little on-air production meeting, how about we talk about our thoughts on The Catcher Was a Spy first, and then we will get to your history with the material?
Sure, absolutely.
So this movie has an pretty incredible cast. We have Paul Rudd playing the main character, Mo Berg. We have Paul Giamatti, Jeff Daniels, Tom Wilkinson, Guy Pearce. It's I think star-studded is an applicable term, and it's a fascinating story of a early mid-20th century baseball player who is recruited by the precursor to the CIA to potentially assassinate, if the occasion calls for it, the director of Nazi Germany's, I guess, nuclear or atom bomb development program.
Right, Werner Heisenberg.
Werner Heisenberg. So, Alan, this movie has been panned by just about, I think, every critic that I've read, and we were talking about how at the Criterion Cinema in downtown New Haven, it's been relegated to the puny little Screen 8 or Screen 9, where it's kind of like a home theater.
You're right, Theater 9, which I aspire to go to more often.
It certainly is a great opportunity for the theater to show movies that people may not otherwise see, but it is strange to see such, again, star-studded cast on this small screen. So I guess my question for you is, did this movie fail for you in the way that it seemed to fail for a lot of other people evaluating it? And if not, why?
Well, you're right. The question is, when you assemble such a star-studded cast and you have such a great story, a baseball player, a Jewish baseball player, graduate of Princeton in 1922, who gets drafted, the greatest baseball player Princeton ever produced, a Jewish guy in the era of the very serious quota system at Princeton, especially at Princeton, which is a kind of southern school in the North. He excels so much. He's drafted by a team called the Brooklyn Robins, which a year later becomes the Brooklyn Dodgers. It's a great story, and then it segues into World War II.
Although we should be clear, this movie doesn't include any of that material. This movie is pretty specifically about 8 years in this man's life between the mid-1930s towards the end of his professional baseball career. I think he's playing with the Boston Red Sox through the mid-1940s when he's at full-blown OSS mode. A fascinating background. Maybe that's part of the problem that the movie does not go. This isn't a biopic per se of Moberg.
Well, that's the interesting cinema theory question. Is when you do a biopic, the received wisdom is that you can't do an entire life in 2 hours. What do you do? What do you flash back to? What do you omit? And in every single scene, obviously, the backstory of every scene is what scenes were not chosen to do, but maybe that's part of the issue of why I don't think of the movie as a kind of failure. It's a failure of expectations. If with such a cast and such a story on paper, it should be greater. But I walked out feeling the word that came to mind is some word that I picked up in one of the reviews, which was flat. So the movie doesn't generate, doesn't build, there isn't a cascade of emotional attachment. And actually, I was trying to think about sometimes I give myself a test about what I remember about a film a day or two later, and I remember it visually. There's something about the palette of colors, what the production design did to evoke, Rome and to evoke Princeton. It's beautifully produced. I'm trying to remember some of the reviews I read. Do I have it right that Tony Scott at the New York Times truly didn't like it, or there was a weekday review which was just a kind of straightforward. My wife said the second time's review was not a plus, but it wasn't a minus. It was just there it is, a kind of flat review for a flat film. I think that's my take on it, and we could talk about why we've come to that impasse.
So I'm glad that you said that you left this movie, that kind of one word describes your experience with this movie, and that's flat, because I had a very similar experience where I left, there was this one word just kind of crowding out anything else in my head after leaving it. That's maybe a synonym for flat. It was inert. Everything about this movie was just flat, inert, uninspiring, which is, I think, also very difficult to mesh with the expectations and with the story that is nevertheless, on display. I don't think the story is told incoherently by any means in the movie. It's told in quite a straightforward fashion. And I think that the problem, unfortunately, I always I'm very reluctant to put any blame on actors for a movie's struggles, because I think that problems with the movie tend to originate with a screenplay or with direction before any one given actor, any one particular,
Although Paul Rudd is taking the hit.
I think that Paul Rudd really struggles as the center of this, which is so strange because his whole career, which primarily in comedy, has been one of this bashful and self-deprecating, just incredible, beautiful. I mean, he's a very attractive man. He has the James Bond movie star good looks, and I think in his filmography he has always played on that to come off as sometimes a bit of a buffoon, sometimes as someone with a very sharp but self-deprecating wit. And here he really, I mean, if the thesis of the movie, and what we'll talk about Nicholas Davidov's book in a second, which this story is based off of, is that Moe Berg is an ambiguous man. Maybe ambiguous is the word that the movie wants us to leave with. Rudd plays ambiguous as flat instead. I mean, this person who knows, upwards of 20 different languages instead, can't seem to muster any of the charisma for the screen that would require the viewing audience to be as intrigued by him as everyone should be.
Well, that's right. I mean, the question is, if you make a movie about boredom, the movie itself shouldn't be boring, even though the subject is. And in the case of this film, the challenge with Moe Berg, who is an enigma, maybe we should quickly outline it. That is, he was a Jewish guy who always kind of sought non-Jewish venues like Princeton, like being a ball player. In the off season, he went to Columbia, your alma mater, I think mine too, to some extent, and got a law degree. And he worked for white shoe firms. He sort of always sought that kind of zone between not this and not that. The problem, what you call inert, and the problem with Rudd is that he doesn't seem to really enjoy his enigmatic self, and he's not struggling with it. He's not even struggling with his queerness in the 1930s and 40s. He simply says, when he's challenged by is that Jeff Daniels, the head of the OSS, when he's being recruited, the question is, are you queer? And he just absorbs the question in a kind of interesting silence.
I believe his mouth is agape.
Yeah, his mouth is...
There's little more than mouth agape.
But what he says is, I keep secrets. I enjoy keeping secrets. And the problem that I discovered when I was, to get back to my relation with Moe Berg, when I was commissioned to write a play about him, is that he is a mystery to himself, and that's the problem. Is that he and the filmmakers have to make decisions about who they think he is, and the material of his life doesn't really help that much, because he never, it seems to me, faced himself.
I think that it may be good to transition a bit to your relationship with this material, but I do want to just a few more quick thoughts on the movie. One, you ask about, I also challenged myself to, a few days after seeing a movie, what scenes do I remember? What do I remember of, my impression of the movie, to see what stuck with me? And unfortunately, the scene that I remember most is a very explicit sex scene with his girlfriend towards the beginning
towards
of the movie,
well, they
which
want
which comes immediately after a somewhat prudish depiction of him walking in and out of a gay bar in Boston. There's nothing there. There's more than hinting. I mean, the movie's making clear that this man is going into a gay bar, but there's no romance or sexual activity there. And then we're presented with, I mean, I'm no prude for what is displayed in movies, but it seemed like such a bizarrely stark contrast where we have this, I don't know, minute-long sex scene with his girlfriend. I think that
she's playing the piano, and
right.
And apparently he's so energized by Mozart or whatever she's playing that he really completely jumps her in a kind of rough way.
But it seems to be a way for him to, well, at least I thought, a way for him to prove to himself that he is not defined by homosexuality or heterosexuality. He seems to be someone who exists above typical human categorizations.
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up because
bit of an Ubermensch,
right? Because I thought the movie made a decision to deal with the enigma of Moberg. Like, who is he? What's his true struggle? Is his true struggle being a kind of a ball player who loves the game but isn't that good at it? Is his struggle that he's a Jewish guy in an anti-Semitic world? Is his struggle that he's a gay man in a world that doesn't accept that at all? And I think the movie makes its decision that he's on the side of the gay subject, but on the other hand, it doesn't struggle with it. It just notes it as one of the more prominent of his unusual qualities. But in fact, if we see if he's has a dalliance in the gay bar, which it continues throughout the movie when he goes to Japan, and then he keeps his relationship with Estelle. We can talk about how much that's true or not based on the Davidoff's biography. But it seems to me that the movie is too timid to really follow through with the struggle of a gay man, and that, I mean, to make us want to root for him. If we wanted to root for his trying to prove that it was okay to be gay or to confront people. In fact, he does slug a guy on his team who accuses him of being gay, just beats the crap out of him, which is a kind of equivalent of the sexual episode, to assert that that's not the case when in fact it is. This is an interesting movie, but the movie doesn't explore that.
I think that is perfectly, but I think that exactly why the juxtaposition of those two scenes stuck out to me is because of that lack of struggle with any of Moberg's more salient, interesting attributes. Let's get into your relationship with the story, because we should have this is the true meat of the episode, listeners. So thank you for sticking with us thus far. You'll see Deep Focus on WNHH LP, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and I'm talking with someone who has written about Moberg, and yet really I don't know many specifics about your history working on the story. Could you tell us and the listeners about, I don't know, how'd you first come across the story of Moberg, and what has been your own creative intersection with his life?
Well, it's funny. I think New Haven must be ground zero, pardon the expression, for Moberg research in the United States, because Nick Davidoff, who wrote in 1999, I believe, not the first, but what has become really the definitive biography of Moberg. Davidoff is a New Havener.
And was on this show previously to talk about the films of Robert Frank. So
there you go. And
thank you, David.
And among things that he's written about are, he did sports articles for the New York Times Magazine. So and I think he was naturally drawn to the Moberg character, because I know a bit about his life, because his aunt is my daughter's godmother, and he had an enigmatic and profoundly talented father. So I think he was really drawn to the subject. And I do think in some of the reviews, comments that he's made in the reviews apropos of Moberg's gayness, he said there was he all his research, he combed all the archives, and there was no evidence that he had a gay relationship with anybody, which of course doesn't mean anything, especially in an era when all gay men passed and many were married. And I think that Mo Berg comes out of that. So what do I have to do with all this? Well, long before I knew about Davidoff, I was commissioned. I don't know how many years ago this is. No, it must be after the Davidoff book.
So the book was 94.
Okay,
like, yeah.
So at least 5 or 6 years later, I was commissioned by the guy to write a play about Mo Berg. And why write?
Who were you commissioned by?
This was a kind of little consortium of Long Island Jewish sports nuts who had produced a series of DVDs and movies about the greatest Jewish basketball players. And so Mo Berg stands out, if you're a Jewish sports fanatic, as a very unusual guy. Certainly not the most baseball accomplished. That would be Hank Greenberg and Koufax, those people. But because he is unusual, there were Jewish ball players at the beginning of the game, but he stands out because there's something about his combination of sports plus this kind of brilliance, which is really not kind of brilliance, but he had a tremendous memory, I think. And I don't think he spoke 10 languages. I think he was able to memorize about 15 or 20 sentences in each language, which he performs in the movie when he goes to Japan.
I'm going to interject maybe throughout this with brief asides about the movie, because I think that may be one of the only successful scenes in the movie.
Good. Wonderful
when
scene.
The team, so he is an aging ball player. He's probably in his mid-30s, late 30s, playing with the Boston Red Sox. He's invited to go over with some other legendary American baseball players to Japan to play an exhibition game.
1936.
1936. And he has this reputation, or he's cultivated this reputation as a language master. Some people think that he speaks Japanese, but he doesn't really. So Paul Rudd on the ball field introduces himself to some, I guess, Japanese press or businessmen, some people dressed in suits on the field, and says basically, I don't know Japanese. I just know this much. Can you please clap me on the back when I'm done talking, so that my friends think that I'm smarter than I actually am?
And I've memorized the speech. So it would have been wonderful. The movie also could have been about a guy who has all these achievements. He's a baseball player, but he bats only .243. He's a language person, but he really he's a bit of an idiot savant about almost everything. The movie could have dealt with that, but everything is it's touched on, and you go to because there's so many fascinating little things. That's like a charm bracelet of things that it didn't dig in. But my relationship to all this is that I was challenged to write a play that would really get Mo Berg. And these people who commissioned me had also optioned previous biography of Mo Berg that was written by a well-known Boston sports writer. So he had the rights to a previous biography, but it wasn't as good as Davidoff's. So I tried to do this, and I wrote many, many drafts of the Mo Berg story. And I at a certain point, because he is a guy who was so through 7 drafts later, I realized that if it was going to be a play that would be seen by like normal people, it couldn't have these surreal elements. And the commissioners of the play wanted something that was more or less conventional. So I ended up writing a play in which we saw Berg through the eyes of the brother and the sister, which is very interesting because he had a very interesting brother, like the first American doctor into Nagasaki, and a sister who was a kind of frustrated artist in her own right. And Berg, after the baseball career, lived on his laurels, and never married, never succeeded in business. Was one of these guys who ended up hanging out at the press box and lived with his brother and sister, mooching off them for the rest of his life.
And I believe Davidoff says in an early chapter that Sam is the older brother.
Sam
ends up kicking him out, right?
Yeah, because he would call up the brother and say, "Can I come by for the weekend?" And like 8 months later, he would still be there. And he was not a good guest. Berg had many, in addition to all these kind of brilliant qualities, he was, I guess you would, I don't like to characterize people with psychological tags, but he was very OCD. He would not let you touch a newspaper until he finished reading it, and he kept them all in a pile. And if you touched the newspaper in the wrong way, he would know that you had lifted it up and put it back down in the pile. He was a very good spy in his own life, because he could notice those kinds. Oh, and he bathed 3 times a day.
So what?
This is a weird guy.
So if we struggled with The Catcher Was a Spy a bit because of the restricted chronology and maybe leaving out, I mean, it's always difficult when you know the source material beforehand because there's certain things you expect to see. But if chronology is a problem that every biographer and every biopic director has to deal with, what was your tack? You said that you told it from the perspective a bit of the siblings' relationship to Berg, but this across the whole life, focused on the end of their lives. What era of Berg did you seek to tackle in your play drafts?
Well, I mean, I sensed also that even from a dramatic point of view, the attempt to assassinate Heisenberg would be a very important element in it. And in fact, based on the evidence that we have, it was a very brief episode. Apparently, he was so nervous that he dropped his gun in the cloakroom. And as far as this elaborate training with the OSS and so on and so forth, you know, the movie takes huge liberties with this, and actually turns the last 20 minutes into a cat and mouse game between Heisenberg and.
How wonderful would it have been if the nerves were on display in this movie? I mean, if there was a bit of that stumbling through. I mean, Paul Rudd's just kind of playing the typical Bond. I mean, Bond is the person who comes to mind, but it's like it becomes a war movie at the end, a war spy movie.
Right, and they have that chess game between these two brilliant minds. I mean, it's yeah. So I think what I did, and there's so many drafts of this play that I did, but in one case, I don't know what I think we flash back to Berg is living with the sister after the brother has thrown him out, and he really has become, in his brother's eyes, a complete bum, but in the sister's eyes, he's a person who not only deserves the Medal of Freedom, he deserves the adoration of America for having potentially saved the country or was given that task. So it becomes a kind of sibling rivalry story. And when he talks about and he refuses to talk to his family about the Heisenberg material because either he thinks it's still classified or he just wants to impress them with secrecy. And he has this habit of because they would like to get some benefits of his living with them and mooching off of them, including some great tales, but he kind of torments them with a finger raised over his shut lips, which infuriates them. So it becomes a story of 3 people, and it's interesting because Berg is this kind of in-between person. I guess my take on it was the 3 or 4 different ways of being a Jew in a Gentile world at this period. The brother becomes a successful doctor, and the sister becomes relatively religious. So she insists on reburying Berg, who died in Newark, New Jersey, where he's buried. She wants to take his ashes to Jerusalem, and the older brother thinks she's out of her friggin' mind. And so they basically are arguing about the disposal of this great hero's remains, and he comes to life in the course of their debating where his sepulcher should be.
I'd love to get your take on that. It's fascinating. I mean, I think what most interests me, I'd love to talk about Berg, the baseball player, a bit, because I think
you see, I took Berg, the Jew, as opposed to the movie, which takes Berg, the closet gay man.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that from what I've read in Davidov's book, probably my favorite line in the Davidov book thus far, I've read maybe the first 100 pages, is I think it's when Berg is off studying at the Sorbonne in Paris after his first summer playing for the Brooklyn Robins, after he's graduated from Princeton, but he's just kind of immersing himself in like 20 classes at Paris. But he's still longing to come back to America to play baseball. He can't shake this itch of his love for playing baseball, despite his incredible capacity for academic achievement. And Davidoff asks, what about this incredibly talented and someone blessed with just an inimitable memory? What was attractive to him about coming back to be mediocre at baseball? Like this man seems to be exceptional in every aspect. What is this attraction to something mediocre? And I think that what you're getting at, and I think what Davidoff gets at, is that there's a certain comfort that he found in baseball. It was a means of assimilation, of shaking off his whatever outsider status he felt as a Jew or as someone who was I don't know, categorically different from everyone in every aspect of his life. But in your, maybe reflecting on the movie, but also in your own research and own place, why, and also considering that you were commissioned by a group of Long Island Jews who are interested in Jewish athletes, what does Moberg's story tell us about baseball, about what baseball meant to him, about what baseball as this broader kind of cultural phenomenon does for immigrants in America? It just seems like I was much more interested in the CIA man as baseball player as opposed to the baseball player as CIA man. I feel like the direction of like the academic towards baseball was a much more interesting one than the other way around. But yeah, I don't know. And did baseball figure prominently in the drafts that you wrote?
Yes, because there's evidence, and I pursued this. This was a big part of one of my drafts, that he was always looking for a job in his retirement. He actually wanted to. Have I made this up or is it in the evidence? I can't tell anymore. He wanted to be baseball commissioner. He loved baseball. I think his relationship to baseball was both because it was one of the great. I mean, I'm not the first one to say that, baseball is the great American, has been, at least up to now, the great American assimilator. And I think he was drawn to it for that, in addition to having great talent. He started out as a shortstop when that's how he was drafted, shortstop. And he got kind of injured, or the catcher got injured and he became the catcher. And if you think about it, great title, The Catcher Was a Spy, but what does the catcher do? The catcher, A, wears a mask, B, gives all the signals, is in charge. The catcher sees the whole field all the time. There's a scene early on in the movie where Berg shakes off the pitcher and throws somebody out because he knew the runner was going to run. And then when somebody asks him, how did you know? He says, I just know. So there's this instinctual quality about baseball, a kind of sense of anticipation that I think I think Berg was drawn to. And also there is a baseball has been analyzed by anthropologists as being almost a kind of secular rite, religious rite. The plate is called the dish, which is the Catholic whatever it is, artifacts from the mass. I think he just was good at it, but he liked to be unusual. And apparently there was one story after another where he speaks Latin to the second baseman, and he explains the infield fly rule in Greek or something. I mean, it's just one thing after another. This is not as bizarre as it sounds, because there is a certain type of intellectual who likes to kind of dangle little crumbs of erudition in front of people who don't know it.
And I love how Davidoff's book opens with all of the different perspectives on Berg from the various sports writers of the 20s and 30s who just ate him up, because whenever they had to produce a column on a down day, they just looked to Berg and say, Professor Berg is doing something absolutely idiosyncratic and arcane over at catcher or shortstop. So let's run with it.
And Casey Stengel used to say he could speak 10 languages but hit in none of them. Although he retired as a .243 lifetime hitter, there were 2 weeks in 1929 when Berg led the league in hitting. He was ahead of Ruth and Gehrig. So he had a tremendous amount of talent there, and I don't know. Wouldn't you want to be like a baseball player? You know, I mean, we love being reporters with the New Haven Independent and doing this program, but
If I could be a shortstop for the Brooklyn Robins, sign me up.
I'll take it anytime.
The last question I want to ask you on the subject is, what is next for your? Can you tell us anything about? I know that you've been reached out to by some people after The Catcher Was a Spy. This movie came out. Are you still working on this dramatic adaptation, or?
Well, they owe me some money. They owe me some money. So,
do they really?
Well, yeah. We're not talking. We're talking about in the like high three figures or something like that. But no, my producers were what is it? They suffered from a lot of Schadenfreude or something about. I mean, they loved the fact that the movie got bad reviews. They were on the phone to me saying this gives us an opening to, because now the world truly needs truly needs the play to get Mo Berg, as if understanding Mo Berg were one of the major questions of our time. The fact is that there is a documentary about Mo Berg coming out by a very good documentary filmmaker that they've been in touch with, named Aviva Kempner, who did Hank Greenberg's biography. So that will be out. You know, one of the versions of my play was done at the Actors Studio, and then we revised it and we did it at the American Jewish Historical Society. There were 200 people there, including a lot of baseball fanatics, because the American Jewish Historical Society has a very big display area about Jewish baseball players. So this was quite a hit there. The problem is that you need to have a star attached to material. The way Paul Rudd and Sienna Miller were attached to this material in order to get this thing elevated to the next step. So as close as my play got to so-called stardom was Tova Feldsha, the actress. She loved the first act, in which she would be playing Mo Berg's sister. So we just have to get her interested in the second act.
So any stars listening, reach out to deepfocusradio.com.
Right,
and we'll connect you with that one.
We're available.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really a delight to be able to talk with you about your not as Schadenfreude-filled response to The Catcher Was a Spy movie. But it's a fascinating story. I'd strongly recommend the Nicholas Davidoff book based on what I've read thus far.
And the movie is really it's worth
using to get acquainted with the story.
You know, the more I think about it, the other problem is, although Paul Rudd has the right face, I think, for Mo Berg, if maybe he didn't use it properly, he just seems too slight to me. And there was because Berg was a big guy, and you're not a major league catcher in the era when the ball was very hard and the gloves were very puny. It's just physically, one doesn't believe, for example, when he's overseas and making his way to Heisenberg, and some GIs participate in a baseball game, and they say that's Mo Berg because he's playing on a level that they're not. And all these guys are huge GIs, and Paul Rudd is like little Ant-Man compared to them. Right. So I think that was a bad casting choice physically. But the movie is it's richly produced. And the evocations of battle when they're on their way really reminded me of Saving Private Ryan. Robert Rodat, the screenwriter for this. I think they did a creditable job. They tried with very difficult material, so I certainly would recommend it.
And maybe less enthusiastic, but yeah, I'd recommend it as well. Are you up for 5 minutes on Won't You Be My Neighbor?
Well, sure. And you know what the transition is?
Yeah. So first, you're listening to Deep Focus on WNHH LP, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and we are about to hear a seamless transition from the story of Mo Berg to the story of Mr. Rogers by Alan Appel. What is that transition? Well,
the Mo Berg, Ben Lewin's Mo Berg film, it puts its bet on that they're exploring Mo Berg as a gay man. That's the primary focus, not the only one, but. Fred Rogers, in Would You Like to Be My Neighbor, was seen by a lot of people because he was so sweet and nice and open and non-macho many people viewed him as a gay man. And this movie, right from the get-go, doesn't just sets that aside, and it helps you understand who Fred Rogers is by telling you as through the original footage that makes up the most of the movie, is that he was a Presbyterian minister. And what you're seeing when you see Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is basically a kind of secular ministry through television.
Yeah. No, I think that, and you're right. I mean, the movie does. So this is a pretty familiar, in terms of film form, a kind of straight up talking head documentary. We just have a lot of archival footage and a lot of people looking at the screen talking. But we're introduced. One of the first interviewees is Fred Rogers' wife, and then we have his two kids. So certainly his heterosexuality is laid, before us, or at least his married life and kids. And then later on, the Officer Clemens, who was is
right.
a gay man, comes out and says, I would have known if Fred. This isn't a big part of the movie, but it's certainly something that the movie is interested in addressing because of the singular, just open, loving, direct, just candid nature of this man, so unlike anything else on TV, probably before or since. I mean, this movie is probably more of a, I think for better and worse, more of a biography of the show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which ran on, it was distributed by PBS from 1968 to 2001, but always recorded in Pittsburgh, kind of where Mr. Rogers is from and where he kind of built his career. And the movie asserts that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, this show for children, coming from a trained Presbyterian minister, and maybe even more importantly, or as importantly, a disciple of a number of groundbreaking child psychiatrists working at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1950s,
exactly,
sets out to create this program that takes children's emotions seriously. He says at one point that he never thought that he had to wear a funny hat in order to have a connection with a child. And over the course of the movie, we see, how he engages with children on, the most serious and pressing topics of, one of the most troubled times in American history, with the first week's shows being indirectly and directly about the Vietnam War, to episodes about assassination after RFK's assassination, about divorce, about death,
right,
racism and segregation.
Right.
He doesn't shy away from, this isn't, even though this show about love and about imagination is, has some of the familiar trappings of the solace and remove from the quote unquote real adult world that kids can live in. He was not interested in keeping that world totally absent from kids. He knew that they saw it, that they were in it, and he wanted to hear their responses to it.
But it was all about it was the PBS version of Martin Buber's I and Thou. It was all about relationship and the Christian the Christian. It was like, it was the love vibe, but genuinely listening to people, everything about his tone, and everything about for me, one of the interesting things that is talked about in the film is the use he makes of silence, slow, delayed response, a lot of looking in the eye. And one of the great sequences, I think, is that the filmmakers got a hold of his testimony before Rhode Island Senator John Pastor's inquiry. It was an angry senator.
The Senate Subcommittee on Communication in 1969. He's appealing for federal government funding of PBS.
They were gonna terminate it or something like that, and he basically totally charms Pastor. I mean, he explains to him what the show is like and what it's about, and the tone he uses is exactly the tone he would use with a 4-year-old. And Pastor turns away from the microphone and says, "I guess you got your 20 million."
It's still shocking watching that and seeing the response of the Senate is in the movie that I find just breathtaking. And there of him outside of his studio, there's quite a bit of very brief snippets of home video or home film that are used to show Mr. Rogers outside of the context of the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood studio. And we see him one swimming underwater in a pool. It's just a couple seconds. I think it's used in the preview as well. He was an avid swimmer, swam every day. The movie talks about his own bizarre numerology of staying at the weight of 143 pounds because 143 corresponds to the number of letters in I love you. I don't know if you remember that, but
I remember
kind
that.
of a bizarre.
Yeah, that was weird.
a bizarre thing,
That's weird. That's worthy of Mo Berg.
Swimming was the way that he kept that, and also of him kind of sitting in this field of grass, I think right before a beach, and the wind is blowing, and the grass. He's kind of at one. He just seems like a man completely at peace with the world and himself. And I think the movie does a great job of finding that material that communicates that peace. Now, what I think the movie really struggles with, or at least doesn't live up to, is pushing on the edges of Mr. Rogers a little bit. It hints at some really potentially interesting and upsetting stuff about his life, and then leaves it by the wayside, particularly in his family life. We get there's one comment from one of his children about how it was a challenge growing up the son of someone who was looked at as the second coming of Christ.
That's right.
And there's very little, if anything, spoken about, again, how difficult it was to be around a man who had this almost like beatific saintly presence. The second, another son, says Mr. Rogers at the dinner table could only voice his anger in the voice of the puppets.
A puppet, yeah.
That just kind of blew me away.
Daniel Tiger.
I mean, talk about some level of suppression.
Yeah, that is weird. I'd like to get Mr. Rogers and Mo Berg in a room together. Now that would be an interesting interview for Deep Focus, Tom. The other biographical piece of information in this movie, Would You Be My Neighbor? It's very good in the way it deploys the biographical information, I think, because it sort of just when you reach the point where you're exasperated about like who was the real Mr. Rogers, they give you a bit of the, as you point out, the family life, but they don't give you too much, and it does it. But one piece that they do the movie does convey, I think, but late in the story, because early on you learn that that the genesis is all out of his seminary experience. But we do learn, I think at least 3/4 of the way through, that this profound desire to be nice has origins even earlier than the seminary, and that is that Fred Rogers, always at weight 143 his entire life, he grew up being called Fat Freddy. And apparently the bullying that he experienced as a fat kid was so extreme that you could argue that created the person who became Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, and that is really not spoken about in the movie. Now, I'm kind of nitpicking a little bit because I think that this movie, another kind of biopic in the vein of the Mo Berg except this is a documentary, and I think a much more successful one. But if biopics struggle with chronology, they also struggle with being like hagiographies, where the person at the center of the movie or the story, because of, you have to have a lot of interest and sometimes reverence for someone to make a whole movie about them. And Mr. Rogers, some would say rightfully so, but this really leans heavily on his saintly side. Now, that said, I think that the movie is very convincing in its argument that there was no show like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on television from the 1960s through the early 2000s, and perhaps there is no show like it now in how seriously and directly it engaged with the emotions of children. And this movie's gotten a lot of praise for reintroducing a kind of pure, unadulterated love into the American media landscape at a time of such, hatred and vitriol and partisanship and stuff. Here is a paragon for someone who just unequivocally felt that each person deserves to be appreciated for exactly who they are. And he was an incredible success. And there's something moving about watching that story.
That's very true. The show had predecessors. In fact, he had a couple of shows in Pittsburgh, I think, versions of this before it developed into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I mean, I think there must have been kid shows all over the place, because I grew up with Sheriff John's Lunch Brigade. That's right. When I was a little kid and homesick from school, I used to eat lunch with this. Well, maybe this is because it's L.A. in the 1950s. This guy was a sheriff, and he would walk, and maybe it was a knockoff. Yeah, he would walk into his sheriff's office, and he would take off his hat the way Mr. Rogers would take off his jacket and put on a sweater. Now, this was L.A., so I'm just wondering if he took off his gun and hung his holster up on the hook and then sat down to have lunch with us. And then we would have to learn how to eat slowly, and then if we finished everything on our plate, we would have joined the Sheriff John's Clean Plate Club. So that doesn't hold a candle to all the love from Mr. Rogers, but it's something.
I do want to say just before we close that this movie is by Morgan Neville, the director of the documentary Best of Enemies, which we spoke about on the second episode of Deep Focus, the one about Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley Jr.
He loves watching old TV, and there's something wonderful about just the straight-on camera, which both movies have.
Alan, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show and to talk about two movies. And I think that your transition was a seamless one indeed. Would you recommend the Won't You Be My Neighbor as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, listeners, you can find over nearly 3 years of conversations about movies in New Haven at deepfocusradio.com. Alan, we'll catch up with you next week.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thanks.